You are floating somewhere you were never meant to be able to reach. 10 meters below the surface of a shallow, murky bay on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, the water is the color of strong tea, thick with centuries of Nile silt that never quite settles. Visibility is measured in arm's lengths. And then, out of that brown haze, a face resolves. Granite. Larger than any face has a right to be. A nose the size of your torso. Eyes that have not looked at daylight in more than 1,000 years, and did not expect to look at anything ever again. This is Abu Qir Bay, a few kilometers off the modern Egyptian coastline near Alexandria. In the summer of 2000, after 4 years of methodical, almost obsessive searching, a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Goddio and his team found something that most historians had quietly assumed was either a myth, a poetic exaggeration, or a city so thoroughly destroyed that nothing of it could possibly remain. They found an entire ancient port. Streets. Temple foundations. Wooden ships still resting in their final berths. Colossal statues lying face down in the mud exactly where they had fallen, undisturbed for over 1,000 years. They had found Thonis-Heracleion, and in finding it, they solved a small, strange puzzle that had bothered classicists for 2 centuries, the puzzle of whether Thonis and Heracleion were 2 different cities, or the same city known by 2 different names to 2 different peoples. They were the same city. One name Egyptian, one name Greek, both describing a port so important that for hundreds of years it was the primary gateway between the Mediterranean world and the Nile. You should sit with that for a moment. This was not a village. This was not a curiosity. Before a young Macedonian king named Alexander stood on a strip of coastline in 331 BCE and decided to found a new city that would eventually bear his name, Thonis-Heracleion was the customs house of Egypt. Every ship carrying grain, wine, silver, or timber, and every ship carrying incense, gold, or exotic goods bound for the temples and treasuries of the pharaohs, passed through this one narrow channel of the Nile's westernmost mouth. It was the checkpoint of the ancient world, the place where the wealth of the Mediterranean paid its toll before it was permitted to touch Egyptian soil. And then, over the course of centuries, it drowned. Not in a single dramatic night, though there were dramatic nights involved, but in a long, patient, geological unmaking that took the city apart piece by piece until the sea simply closed over the place where it had stood, and human memory closed over it not long after. For over 1,000 years, almost nobody alive had ever set eyes on it. It survived only as a name in a handful of ancient texts, a footnote in Herodotus, a line in a temple decree, a rumor half-remembered by classicists who could not agree on where, precisely, to point on a map. And then Goddio's magnetometers picked up an anomaly in the mud, and the rumor became rubble, and the rubble became one of the great archaeological finds of the last century. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment this city was born on the edge of the richest river delta on earth, and follow it all the way down, through gold and gods and forgotten kings, to the silence at the bottom of the bay. Thonis-Heracleion likely rose sometime around the 8th century BCE, at the point where the Nile's canopic branch, one of several fingers by which the river reached the sea, met the Mediterranean. Geography made the site almost inevitable. A river mouth naturally forms a bottleneck, everything moving between the sea and the interior of Egypt has to pass through it. The Egyptians who settled there built their city across a loose cluster of small islands and canals in the marshy delta, connected by wooden bridges, pontoons, and ferries, so that the layout of the place was less like a conventional city on solid ground and more like a Venice of reeds and mudflats, threaded through with waterways that served as its streets. Ships did not simply dock at Thonis-Heracleion. They moved through it, along internal channels, past temple precincts and warehouses and the timber quays where customs officials weighed and taxed and recorded, in meticulous administrative detail, exactly what was entering the kingdom of the pharaohs. By the time Egypt came under Persian rule and then, later, under the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic dynasty founded by one of Alexander's own generals, Thonis-Heracleion had become something more than a customs post. It was a genuine cosmopolitan port city, home to Egyptian priests and Greek merchants living side by side, its harbors crowded with vessels from across the Mediterranean. Divers have since recovered the remains of at least 64 ships from the channels and basins around the city, an extraordinary number, unmatched by almost any other underwater excavation on Earth, along with more than 700 anchors, evidence of a harbor so busy, so continuously in use, that anchors were simply lost, abandoned, or worn out and replaced across century after century of maritime traffic. Coins found scattered through the ruins span an enormous range of dates and origins, suggesting the city's commercial life did not slow gradually into obscurity but rather carried on with real vigor for far longer than many historians had assumed. Picture, for a moment, what arriving there by sea would actually have looked like, in the 4th or 5th century BCE, from the deck of a merchant ship inbound from Cyprus or Rhodes or the Phoenician coast. You would have spent days out of sight of land, navigating by stars and coastline memory the way every sailor of the period did, and then, gradually, the low, flat profile of the delta would rise out of the haze. No mountains, no dramatic cliffs, just an endless green-brown smear of reed beds and river mouths stretching in both directions further than you could see. Somewhere in that smear, a break in the coastline would resolve into a channel, marked, perhaps, by the towering red granite figure of Hapi looming over the harbor entrance, visible from the water long before any human-scale structure came into view. You would be guided and past a scatter of anchored ships waiting their turn, past fishing boats working the shallows, into water that grew steadily busier and more crowded the closer you came to the customs quays, where officials of the pharaoh, men whose entire careers were built around this one narrow choke point of Egyptian trade, would board your vessel, inspect your cargo, and calculate precisely what portion of it belonged, by law, to the temple and the crown before you were permitted to unload a single amphora. At the religious and civic heart of Thonis-Heracleion stood a great temple sacred to Ammonius, in his specific local form as Ammonius-Gereb, worshipped here as the supreme god of the age and, significantly, as the deity who conferred legitimacy on Egyptian kings. This was not simply a place of worship, it was a place where political power was ritually renewed, where a pharaoh's right to rule was, in some sense, confirmed by the god housed within these walls. The temple's foundations, when Goddio's team finally uncovered them, were extensive enough to suggest a structure of genuine monumental scale, comparable in ambition to some of the great temple complexes still standing, in ruin, at Karnak and elsewhere along the Nile. Surrounding it were smaller shrines, a temenos wall enclosing the sacred precinct, and dozens of smaller statues of gods and goddesses, many of them small enough to have been personal votive offerings left by ordinary people asking for favor, health, or safe passage across dangerous water. And this is where the myths begin to fold back into the history. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, a full century or more before the city's later golden age under the Ptolemies, traveled to Egypt and recorded a story that Egyptian priests told him about a temple in this very port. According to Herodotus, there stood at Thonis a great temple dedicated to Heracles, the legendary Greek hero, and that temple carried with it the ancient right of sanctuary. Any fugitive who took refuge inside its walls, laying certain sacred marks upon himself and swearing an oath, could not be forcibly removed. And it was here, the priests told him, that the mythical Helen of Troy and her lover Paris had stopped on their flight from Sparta, blown off course on their way toward Troy, only to have their onward journey interrupted by an Egyptian king who, offended by the theft of another man's wife, detained Paris and sent him away empty-handed, keeping Helen safely in Egypt for the duration of the entire Trojan War. It is, on its face, a strange and almost defiant Egyptian counter-narrative to the great Greek epic, a story insisting that the famous Helen the Greeks fought 10 years over was never actually inside the walls of Troy at all, but sitting quietly in a temple on the Egyptian coast the whole time. For centuries, this passage in Herodotus was treated by many scholars as pure literary invention, a folk tale with no historical anchor, because no one could say for certain where this Temple of Heracles, this Thonis, had actually stood, or whether it had ever really existed as a physical place at all. Then Goddio's team found the temple. They found the temenos of Thonis-Heracleion, and beside it the remains of what had likely served, to Greek visitors, as the Temple of Heracles referenced by Herodotus, because in Greek religious thought of the period, Ammonius and Heracles were sometimes understood as reflections of one another, different cultural masks over a related idea of divine strength and kingship. Suddenly a story that had been filed under myth for 2,000 years had a real address again. It didn't prove that Helen of Troy had literally stood on these stones. Myths are not proven that way. But it proved that the setting was not invented, that Herodotus, or the priests who told him the tale, were describing an actual, specific, physically verifiable place, with real architecture that real people could touch. If you have ever wanted evidence that history has a way of quietly waiting to be corrected, this is close to as good as it gets. A Greek historian's Egyptian gossip, dismissed as fable for 2 millennia, turning out to be geography. If a story like that pulls you in, the kind where a footnote in an ancient book turns out to be a literal, physical place waiting under the water for someone to find it, this channel exists entirely for stories like this one. New episodes on lost cities, vanished civilizations, and unsolved mysteries go up regularly, so if you'd like more evenings spent drifting through history like this, go ahead and subscribe now before we go back down into the silt. Among the objects Goddio's team eventually recovered, few are as striking, or as literally enormous, as the colossal statues that once stood in the temple precinct. 3 monumental red granite figures, dating to roughly the 4th century BCE, were found lying in the mud, a pharaoh, a queen, and the god Hapi, personification of the annual flooding of the Nile that made Egyptian agriculture possible at all. The statue of Hapi alone stands about 5.5 meters tall, a towering figure of abundance and fertility that would have loomed over the temple entrance, visible to every ship approaching the harbor as a kind of divine welcome, or warning, depending on how you behaved on the voyage over. Elsewhere in the ruins, divers found a pair of nearly 5-meter-tall pink granite statues of a Ptolemaic king and queen, likely representing the ruling couple as Egyptian deities, blending Greek royal portraiture with the visual language of pharaonic divinity in exactly the syncretic style the Ptolemies favored throughout their 300-year rule of Egypt. Smaller finds tell equally vivid stories. Dozens of miniature stone sarcophagi were recovered from the site, too small for human remains. These were instead built to hold mummified animals, most likely offerings connected to the sacred rites of Osiris, whose mysteries were celebrated at Thonis-Heracleion with elaborate annual festivals involving processions of boats along the very canals archaeologists have now mapped. Ancient texts describe this festival, known as the Mysteries of Osiris, as one of the great religious events of the Egyptian calendar. A small ceremonial boat, carrying a figure of the god assembled from grain, soil, and water in a symbolic act of yearly rebirth, was floated in procession along a sacred canal linking Thonis-Heracleion to a smaller neighboring temple site nearby, accompanied by priests, torches, and crowds of onlookers lining the banks. The excavated canal itself, its timber-lined edges still traceable beneath the silt, corresponds closely enough to ancient descriptions that some archaeologists now believe they may have located the actual physical route this procession followed, nearly 25 centuries after the last time anyone walked it. In 2001, divers found something rarer still, a fully intact stele of black granodiorite, nearly 2 meters tall, covered edge to edge in hieroglyphic text, bearing a formal royal decree issued in the name of Pharaoh Nectanebo I around 380 BCE. The decree concerns temple taxation, specifically, a portion of the fees collected from goods passing through this exact port, redirected to fund the priesthood of a nearby temple to the goddess Neith. What makes this stele especially remarkable is that it is nearly a perfect twin to another stele, found more than a century earlier at the inland site of Naucratis, and for decades scholars had struggled to understand precisely how the geography and administration described on that stone related to a port called Thonis whose location no one could confirm. Now they had the missing twin, recovered from exactly the site it had always been describing. Excavations have continued for more than 2 decades since that first 2000 discovery, and the site keeps offering up new finds almost every season. In 2023, Goddio's team announced the discovery of the remains of a Greek sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite, containing bronze and ceramic objects of clearly Greek manufacture, strong physical evidence for a community of Greek merchants who lived, worshipped, and likely intermarried within this Egyptian port city, worshipping their own goddess of love within sight of the towering Egyptian Temple of Amun-Gereb next door. Nearby, archaeologists found a cluster of Greek weapons, dating to the early 4th century BCE, a period when Greek mercenaries are known to have been stationed in Egypt to help defend the delta against Persian invasion. It is a small cache of objects, but it hints at an entire strand of the city's history that written sources barely mention: foreign soldiers, garrisoned in an Egyptian harbor town, living and perhaps dying far from anywhere they would have called home. And yet, for all of this wealth and religious significance, the estimate that continues to humble every archaeologist working the site is this: after more than 2 decades of seasonal excavation, researchers believe they have uncovered somewhere around 5% of the ancient city. 95% of Thonis-Heracleion, by this estimate, is still sitting exactly where it fell, still buried in silt, still waiting. So why did a city this large, this wealthy, this central to an empire's economy, end up at the bottom of a bay in the first place? The honest answer is that it wasn't one single catastrophe. It was several, layered across centuries, each one weakening the ground the city stood on until the ground simply could not hold anymore. Thonis-Heracleion was built, from the very beginning, on genuinely unstable terrain, a landscape of soft clay and waterlogged sediment at the outer edge of the Nile Delta, an environment naturally prone to a geological process called soil liquefaction. Under normal conditions, saturated clay-rich soil behaves, more or less, like solid ground. Buildings and streets sit on top of it just as they would anywhere else. But subject that same soil to a sudden, sharp shock, the kind of shock produced by an earthquake, or a rapid change in water pressure from a storm surge or a rapidly rising flood, and the particles in the soil can lose their grip on one another almost instantly. Solid clay, in a matter of seconds, can behave like a liquid. Anything built on top of it doesn't collapse from above, it simply sinks, as though the ground itself has turned to quicksand beneath it. Sediment cores taken from the site show that this happened here, at least once, dramatically. Sometime around the end of the 2nd century BCE, researchers believe the central island on which much of the city's most sacred architecture stood underwent a severe liquefaction event, likely triggered by a combination of a significant earthquake and, quite possibly, an unusually severe Nile flood arriving at the same catastrophic moment. Temples and structures that had stood for centuries dropped, in an geological instant, several meters straight down, and the sea that had always lapped patiently at the edges of the city surged directly in to claim what had been dry land only hours before. That single episode, as violent as it clearly was, did not finish the job. It was simply the sharpest chapter in a much longer, much slower story of subsidence that had likely already been underway for generations, and that would continue for centuries afterward. The entire eastern Mediterranean coastline in this region experiences a gradual, ongoing sinking of its underlying tectonic plate, compounded by the natural, continuous compaction of delta sediment as the weight of new mud and buildings presses down on older, looser layers beneath it, the same slow settling process, incidentally, that has famously plagued Venice for centuries, on a much smaller and slower scale. Add a gradual rise in Mediterranean sea levels across the intervening centuries, and you have a city being attacked simultaneously from below, as the ground beneath it slowly sank, and from above, as the sea slowly rose to meet it. Historical and geological evidence suggests this process accelerated sharply again around the 8th century of the Common Era, nearly 1,000 years after that first great liquefaction event, until finally, sometime in the latter half of that century, the last visible structures of what had once been Egypt's greatest port disappeared beneath the waves entirely, joining everything that had already been lost centuries before. There was no single morning when the people of Thonis-Heracleion woke up and watched their city vanish. There was, instead, a process spanning nearly 1,000 years, in which a great port slowly transformed into a diminished town, then a fishing village, then a scattering of ruins visible only at low tide, then nothing visible at all, a slow erasure so gradual that it's genuinely difficult to say, even now, exactly when the city stopped existing and the ruins of the city began. Part of what makes this story feel less like a disaster and more like a quiet fading is that the city's decline as a place of human importance had already begun for entirely separate, entirely human reasons, long before the ground finished swallowing what remained of it. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great, having taken Egypt from Persian control with barely a fight, chose a stretch of coastline about 30 kilometers to the west to found his new city, Alexandria. It offered deeper, more stable harbors, direct access to the open Mediterranean without the delta's shifting sandbars and silt-choked channels, and, perhaps most importantly for the Ptolemaic kings who would soon rule from there, a fresh setting with no older Egyptian religious establishment already entrenched, a blank architectural canvas on which an entirely new, self-consciously Greek-Egyptian capital could be built from nothing. Trade patterns, inevitably, followed the new harbor. Over the following decades and centuries, Alexandria grew into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to its famous library, its lighthouse counted among the Seven Wonders, its sprawling multicultural population, while Thonis-Heracleion, still functioning, still inhabited, still economically active as excavated coins and pottery clearly demonstrate, nonetheless settled into the role of a secondary port, gradually overshadowed by its glittering neighbor down the coast. It did not become instantly irrelevant. Religious pilgrimage to the Temple of Amun-Gereb likely continued for generations, and the port kept functioning in some capacity for centuries after Alexandria's founding. But the city that had once been the essential gateway of Egypt slowly became one gateway among several, its economic importance visibly declining even as, underground and underwater, the physical ground it stood on continued its own slow, parallel decline. By the time the last structures vanished beneath the Mediterranean in the 8th century CE, Thonis-Heracleion had likely already been a shadow of its former self for hundreds of years, reduced, diminished, perhaps largely abandoned even before the final waters closed over what remained. And once it was gone entirely, so, almost as thoroughly, was the memory of it. Herodotus's account remained in circulation among educated readers across the following centuries, but as a piece of literature, not as usable geography. Nobody after antiquity could confidently say where, along a coastline that had itself visibly shifted, the places he described had actually stood. Later Arab and medieval sources occasionally mentioned a nearby town called Abu Qir, from which the modern bay takes its name, but any specific memory of a great sunken port beneath its waters had, by then, faded into nothing more concrete than local legend and half-remembered names. For well over 1,000 years, that was essentially the entire state of human knowledge about Thonis-Heracleion, a name in an old Greek book, an inscription mentioned in a handful of later Egyptian texts, and a vague, unverifiable sense that something significant might once have existed somewhere near the mouth of the Nile's now vanished Canopic branch. 19th and early 20th century Egyptologists occasionally speculated about its location, and some assumed, reasonably enough given the available evidence, that Thonis and Heracleion had been two separate towns rather than one, since ancient sources referred to them by different names without ever explicitly clarifying the relationship between them. It took the tools of the late 20th century, precision magnetometry, sonar mapping, remote sensing, and decades of patient, methodical underwater survey work, to finally answer a question that ordinary historical scholarship had been unable to resolve for 200 years. Before Goddio ever put a diver in the water, generations of earlier scholars had gone looking for Thonis and Heracleion in entirely the wrong place, for a reason that seems almost obvious in hindsight: they were looking on land. 19th-century travelers and early Egyptologists, working from Herodotus and a handful of other classical references, generally assumed that a port this significant must still be findable somewhere along the modern coastline, perhaps buried under later Ottoman or Arab settlement, perhaps disguised under a changed name. Some proposed it had stood at or near the site of modern Abu Qir itself, others argued for locations further inland, reasoning that 2,000 years of delta silt might simply have pushed the coastline outward, leaving the old port stranded on what was now dry ground. Nobody seriously entertained the idea that the entire city might be sitting, essentially intact, several kilometers out under open water, because nobody had yet reckoned with just how much this particular stretch of coastline had physically sunk, rather than simply silted over. Franck Goddio had spent years surveying this stretch of Egyptian coastline before the specific discovery of Thonis-Heracleion, working in the same general region where Napoleon's fleet had famously been destroyed by the British Navy in 1798, and where earlier searches had already located other sunken ancient sites nearby, including the submerged remains of Napoleonic-era warships and portions of the neighboring city of Canopus, a separate ancient settlement, close enough to Thonis-Heracleion that later writers occasionally confused the two, adding one more layer of tangled geography for modern historians to sort back out. The environment made the work genuinely difficult. Visibility in Abu Qir Bay is often measured in centimeters rather than meters. The seabed is a thick, shifting layer of Nile silt that constantly threatens to bury artifacts again as soon as they're uncovered, and the sheer size of the search area, an ancient landscape now scattered somewhere across many square kilometers of open water, meant that finding any single structure required narrowing the search with magnetometer surveys long before a single diver ever entered the water to confirm what the instruments were suggesting lay beneath the mud. Divers often worked entirely by feel in the worst conditions, running gloved hands along a shape in the silt for minutes at a time before they could form any clear idea of what, exactly, they had found: a column, a statue's shoulder, the curved timber of a hull. When the confirmation finally came in 2000, it didn't just reveal a lost city. It closed a 2-century-old scholarly argument, revealing that the two cities, long debated by classicists, were, in fact, one city known by an Egyptian name to its own people and a Greek name to visiting merchants and travelers, the same pattern of dual naming that shows up again and again across the ancient Mediterranean world, where trading partners routinely translated or adapted foreign place names into something more familiar to their own ears, rather than adopting a foreign word. Wholesale. What continues to draw archaeologists back to Abu Qir Bay, season after season, more than 2 decades after that first discovery, is not simply the scale of what remains, though 95% of an entire ancient port city is, by any measure, an enormous amount of unexplored ground. It's the unusual completeness of the preservation. Because the city sank gradually, largely undisturbed by later human construction or looting, and because it has spent the intervening centuries sealed beneath a protective layer of soft, oxygen-poor silt, an extraordinary amount of organic and fragile material survived here that would never have survived on dry land, exposed to open air, agriculture, and centuries of later building over the same ground. Wooden ship hulls, rope, fabric, even preserved food remains have all been recovered from the site in a state of preservation that would be genuinely unusual for a comparable dry land excavation anywhere in Egypt. In an odd way, the very disaster that destroyed Thonis-Heracleion as a living city is the same disaster that preserved it, almost perfectly, as an archaeological one, sealing an entire working ancient port in mud at the precise moment of its use, rather than leaving it to be picked apart, rebuilt over, and slowly erased by everything that tends to happen to abandoned places left standing in open air. Every excavation season now brings its own small negotiation with the bay's geology. Storms rework the seabed, sometimes exposing sections of ruin that had been quietly reburied by drifting silt since the previous year's dive, and sometimes closing back over trenches that had taken weeks of careful work to clear. Researchers describe the site less as a fixed excavation and more as a slow, ongoing conversation with a moving landscape, one that occasionally hands back an object on its own schedule, with no warning, the way the sea near Abu Qir has apparently been doing, patiently, for over 1,000 years. Advances in underwater sonar and photogrammetry mean the map of the city grows a little more precise every season, even in years when almost nothing new is physically recovered, simply because the instruments themselves keep improving. It is, in its own way, a very modern kind of archaeology, a discovery made not with a shovel and a hunch, but with magnetometers, side-scan sonar, and 20 years of patient, incremental confirmation, one buried wall at a time. We don't know, and may never fully know, exactly what daily life felt like on those wooden bridges and canal-side quays, in the years when this was still the busiest checkpoint in the ancient Egyptian world, what the customs officials said to arriving merchants, what songs the sailors sang while loading grain onto the 64 ships whose skeletons still rest in the mud. What a pilgrim visiting the sanctuary of Amun-Gereb genuinely believed as they left a small votive statue at the gods' feet and asked for calmer water on the voyage home. Herodotus gave us one strange, half-mythical fragment of that world, a story about Helen and Paris that turned out to have a real address after all. Goddio's divers have given us thousands more fragments since, statues, coins, a stele, the outline of streets traced through silt by careful hands working almost blind in water the color of tea. But the fragments they've recovered so far are, by their own estimate, only about 1/20th of what's actually down there, still resting exactly where it settled, centuries ago, into the quiet dark at the bottom of the bay.